December 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes forest. A German ordnance officer holds an American weapon that shouldn't exist. The M1 Carbine, serial number scratched and battered from combat, stripped from a captured GI during the opening hours of what the Allies will call the Battle of the Bulge. He works the action. Smooth, fast, unnaturally fast. He counts the rounds in the magazine. 15. 15 rounds in a weapon that weighs less than his service pistol and holster combined. He looks at his own rifle propped against the wall. The Carabiner, 98K, 5 rounds. Bolt action. Reliable as winter frost. But in the time it takes him to chamber a second round, an American soldier with this carbine could put 6 bullets down range. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics are simple, the implications are not. For nearly 40 years, since the Franco-Prussian War, German military doctrine had been built on a foundational assumption. The rifleman, armed with a precision bolt-action weapon, formed the backbone of infantry firepower. Automatic weapons, the machine guns, existed to support this foundation, not replace it. One man, one well-aimed shot, repeated with mechanical efficiency. This was the German way. This was how wars were won. The M1 Carbine violated every principle of that doctrine, and German engineers, tasked with evaluating captured enemy weapons, were about to confront a truth their entire military establishment had refused to acknowledge. The Americans hadn't just built a better rifle, they'd rewritten the rules of infantry combat, and in doing so, they'd exposed a fatal flaw in German thinking that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. To understand why the M1 Carbine represented such a revolutionary shift, you have to understand what German infantry doctrine looked like in 1944, and more importantly, why it looked that way. The German army didn't arrive at its weapons philosophy by accident. It was the product of decades of military theory, hard-won battlefield experience, and a very specific view of how infantry combat actually worked. The foundation stone of German infantry tactics was the Carabiner, 98K, universally shortened to Car 98K. Adopted in 1935 as the Wehrmacht's standard service rifle, the Car 98K was a masterpiece of German engineering. 5 rounds loaded via stripper clip into an internal magazine, bolt action. Chambered in 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, a cartridge powerful enough to kill a man at 600 meters with proper aim. The rifle weighed just over 8 pounds unloaded, measured 43 inches long, and in the hands of a trained soldier could deliver accurate fire at ranges most modern soldiers would consider absurd. German infantry training emphasized marksmanship above almost everything else. Recruits spent weeks on rifle ranges learning to estimate distance, compensate for wind, and place shots with mechanical precision. The goal was to produce soldiers who could engage targets at 400, 500, even 600 meters with iron sights. This wasn't optional. This was doctrine. The rifleman was expected to dominate the battlefield through superior shooting, not through volume of fire. This doctrine made sense if you understood the context. The Car 98K wasn't designed in a vacuum. It was the evolutionary endpoint of nearly a century of German military rifles, stretching back through the Gewehr 98, used in World War I, all the way to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. That conflict, where Prussian needle guns decimated French infantry at ranges the French thought impossible, had taught German military theorists a critical lesson. Superior range and accuracy meant you could kill the enemy before he could effectively return fire. Control the range, control the battle. So, when German ordnance designers sat down to create the standard infantry rifle for the new Wehrmacht in the 1930s, they optimized for those principles. Long range, high accuracy, powerful cartridge. The fact that this meant a bolt-action rifle, limited to 5 rounds and requiring manual cycling between each shot, was viewed as an acceptable trade-off. After all, if your soldiers were well-trained marksmen engaging at long range, they didn't need high rates of fire. They needed to make every shot count. But here's where the doctrine started to show cracks. German infantry squads weren't just riflemen. The Germans understood, better than most armies of the era, that modern warfare required more than accurate shooting at long range. You needed suppressive fire. You needed the ability to pin enemy forces while your infantry maneuvered. And for that, you needed machine guns. The German solution was the MG-34, and later the MG-42, arguably the finest general-purpose machine guns of World War II. These weapons were the actual center of gravity for German infantry tactics. The standard German infantry squad, by 1944, consisted of 9 or 10 men organized around a single light machine gun. The machine gunner and his assistant carried the weapon and ammunition. Everyone else, equipped with Kar 98K rifles, existed primarily to support the machine gun. They provided security, carried extra ammunition, and engaged targets the machine gun couldn't effectively address. This wasn't unique to Germany. Most armies organized infantry around automatic weapons to some degree. But the Germans took it further. Their tactical manuals explicitly stated that the machine gun was the primary source of firepower, and the riflemen were secondary elements. The riflemen didn't win firefights. The machine gun won firefights. The rifleman existed to get the machine gun into position, keep it supplied with ammunition, and protect it from enemy assault. This created an interesting imbalance. The average German infantryman, carrying his Kar 98K, had a weapon optimized for precision long-range shooting, but his actual job in combat was to support the machine gun, which often meant closing to assault distance, clearing buildings, or defending positions at ranges where a 5-shot bolt-action rifle was less than ideal. The Germans partially addressed this by issuing MP-40 submachine guns to squad leaders, vehicle crews, and specialized troops. The MP-40 was a 9mm weapon feeding from 32-round magazines, fully automatic, effective to about 100 meters. But here's the critical detail that German ordnance officers understood perfectly well. The MP-40 and the Kar 98K didn't overlap. They complemented each other, but they served completely different roles. The Kar 98K was for long-range precision. The MP-40 was for close-range firepower. There was no middle ground, no weapon that could deliver accurate fire at 200 meters and still provide respectable volume of fire at 50 meters. You picked one or the other based on what you expected to encounter, and if you guessed wrong, you were stuck with the wrong tool for the job. The Americans, it turned out, had been thinking about this problem too. But they'd reached very different conclusions, and the weapon sitting on that German officer's desk in December 1944 was the physical manifestation of American military philosophy, a philosophy that German doctrine had no framework to comprehend, let alone counter. The story of the M1 Carbine doesn't start with brilliant engineering vision. It starts with a logistics headache. In 1940, as the United States watched Europe devour itself and began the slow, painful process of rearmament, the Army Ordnance Department faced a problem that sounds almost comical in retrospect. What do you give the troops who aren't actually infantry? The standard issue rifle was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic masterpiece chambered in .30-06 Springfield, 8 rounds, gas-operated, capable of sustained, accurate fire at ranges exceeding 500 yards. It was, by any measure, one of the finest infantry rifles ever designed. It was also 43.6 inches long, weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded, and kicked like an angry mule. For frontline infantry squads trading shots across Norman hedgerows or Pacific jungles, these characteristics were acceptable, even desirable. The M1 Garand could deliver overwhelming firepower at the ranges where infantry combat actually happened. But the army had a problem. For every rifleman slogging through mud with an M1 Garand, there were 3 or 4 soldiers whose primary job wasn't shooting people: artillery crews, truck drivers, radio, operators, mortar teams, combat engineers, tank crews. These soldiers needed some form of personal defense weapon. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Something more effective than the M1911 pistol but less cumbersome than a full-sized rifle. The existing solution was the M1903 Springfield, the bolt-action rifle the Garand had replaced, or the Thompson submachine gun. The Springfield had the same problems as the Garand: too long, too heavy, too much recoil. The Thompson was even worse. 11 pounds loaded, fired expensive 45 ACP pistol ammunition, and was so over-engineered it cost more than some artillery pieces. Neither weapon made sense for a truck driver who needed something compact enough to keep in a vehicle cab and light enough not to interfere with his actual job. In 1940, the Ordnance Department issued specifications for a new weapon category they called a light rifle. The requirements were specific: weight no more than 5 pounds, effective range of 300 yards, compact, enough for vehicle crews and paratroopers, semi-automatic operation. And critically, it had to be cheap and fast to produce, because they were going to need millions of them. In May 1941, the Ordnance Department held the first round of trials. 9 designs showed up, submitted by everyone from major firearms manufacturers to independent inventors. The Army tested all of them and rejected every single one. None met the specifications, most were too heavy, several were unreliable. A few managed to be both too heavy and unreliable, which takes a special kind of incompetence. The Ordnance Department scheduled a second round of trials for September. Winchester Repeating Arms Company, one of America's premier firearms manufacturers, hadn't submitted a design for the first round. They'd been too busy fulfilling contracts for M1 Garand production. But in late August, Winchester management decided to take a gamble. They had an in-house project, a scaled-down rifle design, based loosely on the Garand's gas operating system, but chambered for a proprietary cartridge they'd developed called the .30 Carbine. It was an intermediate round, more powerful than a pistol cartridge, but substantially less powerful than full rifle ammunition. .30 caliber bullet, 110 grains, muzzle velocity around 1900 feet per second. Winchester engineers, led by a man named Edwin Pugsley, built a prototype in 13 days. 13 days from drawing board to functioning weapon. They cobbled together components from other Winchester designs, hand-fitted parts that should never have worked together, and created something that looked more like a gunsmith's fever dream than a military weapon. But when they tested it on their private range, it functioned. Barely. They shipped the prototype to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland with hours to spare before the September deadline. The hand-built prototype had reliability problems. The feed system jammed. The PLAS extractor occasionally failed to pull spent cases from the chamber. But the basic concept worked, and the Army saw enough promise to give Winchester permission to refine the design. Winchester engineers tore the prototype apart and started over. They kept the basic operating system, a short-stroke gas piston tapping gas from the barrel to cycle the action. They kept the .30 Carbine cartridge, which delivered enough energy to be effective at 200 to 300 yards without producing punishing recoil. They redesigned everything else. New bolt, new feeding system, new stock, new barrel. The second prototype competed against the remaining candidates in late September 1941. Winchester won, unanimously. On October 22, 1941, 6 weeks before Pearl Harbor, the Army officially adopted the design as the U.S. Carbine, caliber .30 M1. Production contracts went out immediately. Winchester got the initial order for 350,000 carbines. The Army also contracted with General Motors Inland Division, IBM, and eventually 8 other manufacturers, because they knew they'd need millions of these weapons, and no single factory could produce them fast enough. The M1 Carbine that rolled off production lines starting in mid-1942 was unlike any weapon the US military had ever fielded. It weighed 5.2 pounds unloaded. Total length was 35.6 inches. It fed from a 15-round detachable box magazine. The action was semi-automatic, gas-operated, meaning every trigger pull fired 1 round and automatically chambered the next. Effective range was realistically about 200 yards for aimed fire, though the ballistics tables claimed 300. The .30 Carbine cartridge was the key to the whole design. By using an intermediate power round rather than full rifle ammunition, Winchester engineers had created a weapon that was controllable, lightweight, and easy to shoot, while still delivering enough energy to be tactically useful. The 110-grain bullet wouldn't penetrate heavy cover the way a 30-06 round could, but it would absolutely ruin a human target at typical combat ranges. But the feature that would prove most revolutionary wasn't the weight or the size or even the semi-automatic action. It was that 15-round detachable magazine. 15 rounds. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A German soldier with a Kar 98K could fire 5 rounds before needing to reload, a process that required pulling a 5-round stripper clip from his ammunition pouch, positioning it over the rifle's internal magazine, stripping the rounds down with his thumb, discarding the empty clip, and working the bolt to chamber the first round. This took between 3 and 5 seconds for a trained soldier under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with cold fingers, adrenaline, and incoming fire, it took longer. An American soldier with an M1 Carbine could fire 15 rounds, drop the empty magazine, slam in a fresh one, and be back in action in under 2 seconds. He didn't need to manipulate individual cartridges. He didn't need to work a bolt. He just needed to swap magazines and keep shooting. And because the magazines were detachable and relatively compact, he could carry 6 or 7 loaded magazines in standard ammo pouches without excessive bulk or weight. That meant 100 rounds of immediately available ammunition compared to the 30 or 40 rounds a German rifleman typically carried in stripper clips and loose in his pouches. The rate of fire was even more dramatic. A skilled soldier with a Kar 98K might manage 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions, assuming he didn't need to reload mid-string. The M1 Carbine, semi-automatic with no manual actions required between shots, could sustain 30 to 40 aimed rounds per minute for as long as the ammunition held out, double the rate of fire, triple the magazine capacity, and all in a package that weighed 3 pounds less than the German rifle. The Germans knew about the M1 Carbine almost as soon as American troops started carrying them in combat. North Africa, late 1942, was where Wehrmacht forces first encountered the weapon in significant numbers. German intelligence officers collected captured examples, photographed them, and forwarded them to the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, for evaluation. The Waffenamt system was methodical, almost obsessive in its documentation. Every captured foreign weapon received a designation code and was entered into the official catalogue of foreign equipment, the Kennblätter Fremden Geräts. The M1 Carbine was classified as Selbstlade Karabiner 455, or Self-Loading Carbine 455, American. The designation alone tells you something important. The Germans recognized it as self-loading, meaning semi-automatic. They recognized it as a carbine, meaning a compact weapon intermediate between a rifle and a pistol. But the real question was whether they understood what it represented. The first detailed German evaluation reports came back from weapons testing facilities in early 1943. The reports acknowledged certain positive characteristics. The weapon was well made. The action was reliable under testing. The cartridge, while underpowered by German standards, was adequate for close to medium-range engagements. Weight and size were excellent for vehicle crews and support personnel. Then came the criticisms, and this is where German doctrine reveals itself. The reports noted that the .30 carbine cartridge lacked penetration compared to full-powered rifle rounds. Accuracy at ranges beyond 200 meters degraded significantly. The weapon would not be suitable as a primary infantry rifle. These observations were factually correct. The M1 Carbine wasn't, designed to replace the M1 Garand. It was never intended to engage targets at 500 meters, but the German evaluators were so focused on what the carbine couldn't do that they missed what it could do. They missed, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, that the Americans had created a category of weapon that didn't exist in German doctrine. Not a rifle, not a submachine gun, something in between. A weapon that could deliver rifle-caliber accuracy at typical combat ranges while providing submachine gun rates of fire and magazine capacity. The Americans weren't trying to build a better Kar 98K. They were solving a completely different problem, and in doing so, they'd stumbled onto something that would change infantry combat forever. The real proof came when German soldiers, not weapons testers, got their hands on captured M1 carbines. Propaganda photographs from the Ardennes offensive show SS and Fallschirmjäger troops carrying them, not because German command issued them, because individual soldiers picked them up off dead Americans and kept them. In a military force that was typically rigid about equipment standardization, this was remarkable. German soldiers were choosing to carry captured weapons despite the logistical nightmare of non-standard ammunition. That should have told the Waffenamt everything they needed to know. But it didn't. Or rather, it did. But by the time German ordnance truly understood the implications, it was too late to matter. By the spring of 1944, German ordnance had tested enough captured M1 carbines to understand exactly what they were dealing with. The technical evaluations were complete, the ballistics were documented, the action mechanism had been disassembled, examined, and photographed. What remained was the harder question. What did this weapon mean for German infantry doctrine? The answer came from an unexpected source, not from weapons testing facilities in Germany, but from the frozen forests of the Eastern Front, where German soldiers were discovering in the most brutal way possible that magazine capacity mattered more than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. The Soviet PPS-41 submachine gun had been terrorizing German infantry since 1941, feeding from either a 71-round drum magazine or a 35-round box magazine, firing at 700 rounds per minute. The PPS-41 gave Soviet infantry overwhelming close-range firepower. German soldiers, armed with Kar 98K rifles, limited to 5 rounds and requiring manual bolt operation between each shot, found themselves catastrophically outgunned in urban combat, forest fighting, and trench warfare. The standard German response was to increase the distribution of MP-40 submachine guns. But the MP-40 had its own limitations, 32-round magazines that were prone to feeding failures if fully loaded, meaning soldiers typically loaded only 28 or 30 rounds. A relatively slow rate of fire at 500 rounds per minute. And most critically, the 9mm Parabellum cartridge was effective only to about 100 meters. Beyond that range, the bullet energy dropped off dramatically, making the MP-40 useless for anything but close-quarters combat. What the Germans needed, though they were slow to recognize it, was exactly what the Americans had stumbled onto with the M1 Carbine, a weapon that bridged the gap between rifles and submachine guns. Something with rifle caliber effectiveness at medium ranges, but with the magazine capacity and rate of fire to compete with submachine guns in close combat. The Americans called it a carbine. The Soviets, developing similar concepts with intermediate cartridges, would eventually call it an assault rifle. The Germans, when they finally accepted the concept, would call it the Sturmgewehr. But that acceptance came slowly, painfully, and years too late to change the outcome of the war. Development of what would become the Sate G44 actually predated German encounters with the M1 Carbine. The conceptual work started in the late 1930s, driven by a recognition that most infantry combat happened at ranges far shorter than rifle designers had traditionally optimized for. Studies of World War I engagements showed that the vast majority of rifle fire occurred at ranges under 400 meters, often much closer. The massive, powerful cartridges that German and other armies had developed for their battle rifles, designed to kill at 600 meters or beyond, were overkill for typical combat ranges. They generated excessive recoil, required heavy weapons to control, and limited the amount of ammunition a soldier could practically carry. Engineers at Haenel, working with ammunition designers at Pulte, developed an intermediate cartridge called the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz. Kurz meaning short in German. It fired the same caliber bullet as the Kar 98K, but in a shortened case with reduced powder charge. Muzzle velocity around 2,250 feet per second, compared to 2,700 feet per second for the full-power 8mm Mauser cartridge. This reduced velocity meant less recoil, which meant the weapon could be made lighter and could potentially handle automatic fire without becoming uncontrollable. The prototype rifle, initially designated Maschinenkarabiner 42, underwent testing in 1942 and 1943. The design was refined, simplified for mass production, and redesignated MP-43, then MP-44, and finally, in October 1944, given its famous name by Hitler himself, Sturmgewehr 44, Assault Rifle 44. The Saint G44 was revolutionary, gas-operated, selective fire, capable of both semi-automatic and full automatic modes. Effective range of 300 meters in automatic, fire, 600 meters in semi-automatic. Magazine capacity, 30 rounds. 30 rounds. That number should sound familiar. The Germans had arrived, through years of battlefield experience and engineering development, at the same magazine capacity the Americans had been issuing since 1942 with the M1 Carbine. The Saint G44 weighed 11 pounds loaded, compared to the M1 Carbine's 6 pounds. It fired a more powerful cartridge, the 7.92 Kurz, delivering substantially more energy than the 30 carbine round. But the fundamental concept was identical. High magazine capacity, intermediate power cartridge, effective at typical combat ranges without the excessive weight and recoil of full-power battle rifles. Here's where the timeline becomes interesting. The Saint G44 didn't enter mass production until mid-1944. By that point, American forces had been carrying M1 carbines in combat for nearly 2 years. German soldiers in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy had been capturing M1 carbines and using them since 1942. The Waffenamt had detailed technical evaluations of the carbine by early 1943. Did German engineers study the M1 carbine and use it as inspiration for the Saint G44? That's impossible to prove definitively from available records. The Saint G44's development was independent, driven by German battlefield experience on the Eastern Front, but it's impossible to believe that German ordnance officers, looking at captured M1 carbines with their 15-round magazines and intermediate power cartridges, didn't see the parallels with their own Sturmgewehr development program. What we do know is this. By late 1944, when the Saint G44 finally entered production in meaningful numbers, German soldiers who got their hands on one immediately understood what they'd been missing. Troops equipped with the Sturmgewehr consistently reported that it transformed their combat effectiveness. The combination of magazine capacity, rate of fire, and effective range gave individual German soldiers firepower that had previously required an entire squad centered around a machine gun. But production numbers tell the brutal truth. By the end of World War II, Germany had manufactured approximately 425,000 Saint G44 rifles. That sounds impressive until you compare it to American production. Over 6 million M1 carbines, over 4 million M1 Garand rifles. The Germans had created a revolutionary weapon and then failed to produce it in quantities that could matter strategically. The real test of any weapon system isn't what happens in testing facilities. It's what happens when soldiers use it in combat. And by late 1944, German soldiers were picking up M1 carbines off battlefields and keeping them despite the logistical nightmare of non-standard ammunition. That tells you everything you need to know about how effective these weapons were in practice. The staged propaganda photographs from the Ardennes offensive show German soldiers carrying captured American equipment, including M1 carbines. Those photos were meant to demonstrate German prowess in capturing enemy materiel. What they actually demonstrated was that German infantry, given a choice between their issued weapons and captured American carbines, frequently chose the American weapon. The ammunition problem was significant. The 30 carbine cartridge was unique to American weapons. German logistics couldn't supply it. Soldiers carrying captured M1 carbines had access only to whatever ammunition they could scavenge from dead or captured Americans. This meant the weapon was useful only for short-term battlefield pickup, not for sustained operations. A soldier might use a captured carbine to clear a building or hold a defensive position, but once the ammunition ran out, the weapon became deadweight. Yet soldiers kept picking them up. Volkssturm units, the hastily organized militia forces defending Germany in the final months of the war, were documented using M1 carbines. These were old men and teenagers with minimal training, issued whatever weapons could be scraped together. The fact that they chose to use captured American carbines, despite having no reliable ammunition source, speaks volumes about how much more effective these weapons were compared to the alternative, which in many cases was nothing at all. The German military never officially integrated captured M1 carbines into their logistics system. There was no German designation for .30 carbine ammunition, no attempt to manufacture it or stockpile captured supplies. The weapon was classified as Selbst Lade Karabiner via Fünfer in official documents, but that designation was purely for identification purposes, not indication of formal adoption. Compare this to captured Soviet weapons, which the Germans did integrate into their supply systems. They manufactured ammunition for captured Soviet rifles and machine guns. They issued them to second-line troops and occupation units. They created training materials and maintenance manuals. The fact that they never did this for the M1 Carbine, despite its obvious utility, reveals something important. The Germans understood that the carbine represented a doctrinal challenge they couldn't easily accommodate. Issuing M1 carbines to German troops on a large scale would have required admitting that their entire infantry weapons philosophy was flawed. That magazine capacity mattered more than long-range accuracy. That the average soldier needed 15 rounds immediately available, not 5 rounds of superior ballistic performance. That American engineers, working on a compressed timeline to create a weapon for support troops, had accidentally designed something more tactically useful than the Kar-98K, the product of decades of German military rifle development. That admission never came, at least not officially. But it came in other ways. In the rushed development of the St. G44, in the increasingly desperate attempts to increase MP40 production, in the soldiers who picked up captured carbines and used them until the ammunition ran out. The battlefield spoke, even if Berlin refused to listen. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and American units pushed across Germany from the west, the question of infantry small arms doctrine had become academic. Germany was defeated, the war was over, but the lessons remained, and they would shape military small arms development for the next 70 years. The Soviet Union, which had captured massive stocks of German equipment, including St. G44 rifles and technical documentation, immediately began developing its own assault rifle. Mikhail Kalashnikov's AK-47, adopted in 1947, used an intermediate cartridge directly inspired by the German 7.92 Kurs, magazine capacity, 30 rounds. The design philosophy was identical to the St. G44 and remarkably similar to the M1 Carbine. High magazine capacity, intermediate power cartridge, effective at typical combat ranges. The United States, having spent the entire war equipping support troops with M1 carbines, took longer to fully embrace the assault rifle concept. The M14, adopted in 1957, was essentially an updated M1 Garand, full power 30-06, replaced by the only slightly less powerful 7.62 NATO, but the same basic philosophy. 20-round magazine, yes, but still optimized for long-range accuracy over volume of fire. It wasn't until the Vietnam War that American doctrine finally caught up with what the M1 Carbine had been trying to tell them since 1941. The M16, adopted in 1964, was an assault rifle in every meaningful sense. Intermediate cartridge, 5.56 mm, 30-round magazine, lightweight, effective at typical combat ranges. It was what the M1 Carbine would have evolved into if American ordnance had been willing to admit that support troops and frontline infantry actually needed the same capabilities. The Germans, in their post-war rearmament, went straight to the assault rifle concept. The G3, adopted by the Bundeswehr in 1959, was a direct descendant of late-war German development work on improved Sturmgewehr designs. The G3 fired 7.62 NATO because that's what NATO standardization required, but it was clearly an assault rifle, not a battle rifle. And when Germany eventually adopted the G36 in the 1990s, firing 5.56 mm from 30-round magazines, the lineage was clear. 8 G44 to G3 to G36. Each generation learning from the last that magazine capacity and intermediate cartridges won firefights. So what did German engineers conclude when they tested that captured M1 Carbine back in 1943? The official reports were careful, clinical. They noted the weapon's technical characteristics. They acknowledged its suitability for certain specialized roles. They pointed out its limitations in range and penetration compared to full-power battle rifles. What they didn't say, at least not in writing, was what battlefield soldiers were learning the hard way. That 15 rounds immediately available beat 5 rounds of superior ballistic performance. That semi-automatic fire beat bolt action in any engagement closer than 400 meters. That the Americans had built a weapon optimized for how infantry combat actually happened, not how pre-war doctrine said it should happen. The M1 Carbine wasn't perfect. The .30 carbine cartridge lacked stopping power in some situations, a complaint that would follow it through Korea and Vietnam. The early 15-round magazines had feeding reliability issues until the design was refined. The weapon was sensitive to dirt and required regular maintenance, but none of these problems outweighed the fundamental advantage. A soldier with an M1 Carbine could put 15 rounds downrange in the time it took a soldier with a Kar 98K to fire 5, and then reload in under 2 seconds to do it again. German engineers understood this. They wrote reports about it. They noted the implications. Some of them certainly recognized that the M1 Carbine represented exactly the kind of weapon German infantry needed, especially on the Eastern Front where Soviet forces were drowning them in PPS submachine gun fire. But understanding the problem and fixing it are different things. Germany's industrial base was already strained by 1943. Raw materials were scarce. Manufacturing capacity was being bombed regularly. The logistics system was breaking down. Even if German ordnance had wanted to copy the M1 Carbine directly, which doctrine wouldn't allow, they lacked the industrial capacity to do so at scale. The St. G44 was the compromise, a weapon that incorporated the lessons of the Eastern Front and the intermediate cartridge concept, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The irony is almost painful. American engineers designed the M1 Carbine as a secondary weapon for support troops. They optimized it for weight and size, not combat effectiveness. They expected it to be used primarily by drivers, artillery crews, and headquarters personnel who needed something better than a pistol, but didn't need a full combat rifle. What they accidentally created was a weapon that perfectly addressed the needs of modern infantry combat at typical engagement ranges. And by the time German engineers fully understood what the Americans had done, it was too late to matter. The M1 Carbine changed infantry warfare, not through revolutionary technology or brilliant tactical innovation, but through the simple recognition that soldiers needed more. Ammunition immediately available and less time spent reloading. 15 rounds and 2-second magazine changes weren't impressive compared to a 30-round State G44 or a 71-round PPS-41 drum, but they were revolutionary compared to 5 rounds and a bolt action. German soldiers, picking up captured M1 Carbines in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, understood this immediately. The officers who evaluated the weapon in testing facilities understood it too, even if doctrine wouldn't let them say so. And the engineers developing the Sate G44, whether they studied captured carbines or not, arrived at the same conclusions. Magazine capacity matters. Rate of fire matters. And sometimes the support weapon is actually the better combat rifle. That's the lesson the M1 Carbine taught. And though it took different armies, different amounts of time to learn it, eventually everyone arrived at the same place. The modern assault rifle, standard issue for virtually every military on Earth, is the intellectual descendant of that hasty Winchester prototype built in 13 days in August 1941, intermediate cartridge, detachable magazine, effective at typical combat ranges, light enough to carry all day. The Germans built a better version with the St. G44, but the Americans built it first, issued 6 million of them, and proved the concept worked before German industry could respond. That's what the captured M1 Carbine sitting on that ordnance officer's desk in December 1944 represented. Not just a weapon, But the future of infantry combat, mass-produced and distributed while Germany was still arguing about whether the future was even allowed under existing doctrine. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.